From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
On behalf of the Music Division of the Library of Congress, I'd like to welcome you to this afternoon's symposium, Dvorak in the New World, presented by the library in collaboration with the Embassy of the Czech Republic. I'm Anne McLean, and I'm delighted to be partnering with the Embassy in this project on behalf of the Music Division. It's part of the impressive Mutual Inspirations Festival 2011. It's taking place around the city this fall. I know a lot of you have already been to some of the interesting programs. And as you've been seeing, the festival draws in many of Washington's major cultural institutions to mark the 170th anniversary of Antonin Dvořák's birth. I'd like to acknowledge our partners, Barbara Karpetova, the embassy's first secretary, who is, by the way, a cultural diplomat, but also a musicologist. The festival has been Dr. Karpetova's project, and she has been listed some very distinguished collaborators, as you can see if you look at the website for the festival, www.mutualinspirations.org. Also, I'd like to thank Mary Fetzko, the embassy's public relations specialist. We're very pleased today to have one of the world's foremost Dvorak scholars speaking this afternoon. Michael Beckerman is Carroll and Milton Petrie Professor of Music and Chair of the Music Department at New York University. He's received the Janacek Medal from the Czech Ministry of Culture and is the laureate of the Czech Music Council. His books include Dvorak and His World, Janacek as Theorist, and New Worlds of Dvorak. Joining him today for the symposium is Eva Velická, the director of the Dvorak Museum in the Czech Republic. Also a musicologist, Dr. Velická is a Martinu scholar, and she is the founder of Omni Musa, an organization devoted to supporting the creation of new music and the interconnection of music and other artistic genres. So following these presentations, you'll have a chance to examine some of the facsimiles in our foyer, and afterwards, as you saw from the program, we'll have a recital with tenor Reginald Buchnight. But I'd like to just briefly introduce Barbara Karpetova now and have her tell you a little bit more about the proceedings. Thanks so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very happy to be here, and as a partly scholar, I'm in fact very thrilled to be here. This is the Library of Congress. It's quite special, I would say. I am very thrilled how the Dvorak's music and everything which connects him is welcome here in Washington, D.C. This is my really warm thank you to Washington, D.C. community. It's very, very educated community, and all of the events we are trying to set up are really welcome. Thanks for that, Washington. And I guess there are too many scholars today, so I would give the floor to the one who is here today with us, who came over from New York, who's going to lead us through the symposium, is Dr. Beckerman. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Barbara. Barbara, for putting together such a wonderful series of programs. It's been very exciting. And of course, to all the distinguished guests who are here. So last year, several members of the Czech Embassy, in particular Barbara, decided that in order to celebrate Dvořák's 170th birthday, the manuscript of the New World Symphony should make something like a triumphant return to these shores since the first time in the 1890s. This entire festival, Mutual Inspirations, was organized around this, and I stand here today along with the director of the Dvorak Museum in Prague and many others engaged with the issues and realities related to this manuscript. Obviously, the very fact that this event was conceived by the capable and imaginative cultural arm of an embassy lends it something of a political tinge, drawing attention as it does to the long-standing and fruitful ties between the United States and the Czech Republic, which go back to the 90s, of course, 1993, but of course, Czech-American relations predate this very recent milestone. And we all know that more than 100 years before the Czech Republic was born, Dvořák arrived in New York to direct the National Conservatory. Almost immediately, he came under the influence of such figures as Jeanette Thurber, Henry Thacker Burley, and Henry Kraybill, and by the new year had decided to write a symphony with references to African-American song, Native American drumming. It was a very up-to-date symphony in many ways because Dvořák used Twitter. Well, in this case, it was the tweets of robins and bluebirds. I only put in that joke because there are some really boring parts in the middle of the paper, and it's supposed to compensate for them, but you can decide whether it does. There's possibly even a quote from Yankee Doodle, not to mention several movements based on Longfellow's Song of Hiawatha. Surely the New World Symphony was a political statement of sorts, at the very least an attempt to both demonstrate and advocate cultural pluralism to American musicians, composers, and audiences, many of whom were and sometimes still are resistant to the idea. Dvořák's American years were exciting times filled with vigorous assertions, ardent debate about what it meant to be American, and who precisely was allowed into the mix. We all agreed that bringing over the New World manuscript was an ideal way to commemorate these events and draw attention to some of the issues. By the spring, we were ready to go, and everything from air transport to security guards had been planned. But as the story goes, a funny thing happened on the way to the forum, revealing, I think, things about the role and value of a manuscript in our culture that we might not have been aware of. This particular thing involves blood plasma because for almost as long as the fictional trial in Čapek and Janacek's Macropolis case, the Czech government has been involved in a nasty spat with a plasma trading company. I will avoid describing these events in extensive detail because, like so many things today, you can find out all about it on the internet. Suffice it to say that things got so out of hand this spring that certain artworks belonging to the Czech government were impounded in lieu of payment. This was done on the order of a court in Vienna, and while it is heartening to contemplate that this could actually bring attention to the Czech cubist Emil Fila, a wonderful painting, it had a deeply disheartening effect on the international movement of national treasures. So the New World manuscript was not going to be leaving anytime soon. Of course, we have some hopefully rich compensations for you in the thoughtful choice of facsimiles that we brought, that Eva's brought. And since there's no downside that does not also have some kind of an upside, there's a certain benefit to not having the original present, one of which is to consider the nature of such a manuscript. The whole thing suggests that a national treasure is a very complicated thing indeed, and especially a musical autograph. Not simply a record of a composition in the composer's hand, such things are routinely treated as holy icons to be displayed and venerated. Yet in this way, they're also a kind of reductive black box. Our worship is based on a strange combination of knowing and a willful desire not to know. For we have a tendency to worship most powerfully that which is irreducible and indescribable. This translates to the very way we display such things. Unlike statues and paintings and meteorites, manuscripts are also somewhat weird. We exhibit them as if they were works of art and venerate them, but unlike Michelangelo's David, which one can walk around and examine, you know, the most you can show when you display a manuscript is figure it out, right? 2 pages. You can't do anything more, which is sort of like bringing Michelangelo's David and like only able to show one of his fingers. And by the way, if anybody remembers, there was a time when a statue was exhibited as if it was a manuscript at the World's Fair when Michelangelo's Pietà came and they put it on a conveyor belt and you had between 60 and 90 seconds to that. So, and let's face it, a visiting artifact tends to take up all the air in the room, as befits a true celebrity. I sort of realized that this was the case with celebrities. First time I ever actually gave anything like a public talk, I was like a junior in high school, and I'd been selected to be part of a panel of peer discussants. I was very proud of myself, you know, peer discussant. It was a big room in a hotel, it was first time ever, and there I was discussing, and then suddenly the basketball player, Bill Bradley, senator, walked into the room, and then nobody paid any attention to anything we said. The only thing that anybody remembered was that. So a manuscript is like a celebrity and a kind of sacred icon and an object standing in for the composer we venerate. Its quasi-religious status reminds us that probably the first books put in cases and exhibited were exquisite and ornate Bibles. In addition to this, any manuscript brought over by a foreign government and shown in this official library of the United States has a good deal of political traction as well. From the story of the manuscript's derailment in terms of these events, we might conclude that it has an economic value as well. But this is something I will consider only at the very end of this paper. Having established that manuscripts may be worshipped, celebrated, scientifically studied, and used as economic ransom, I'd now like to suggest they're also a source of other kinds of material that can inspire us to think broadly about a range of issues. Since the legal procedure is a congenial and appropriate model for obvious symbolic reasons in this case, I'd like to spend the rest of our time in an imaginary court where a team of legal experts, including prosecutor, defense attorney, judge, and jury, will consider several important cases related to our study of Dvorak. First, is the New World American music? One of the biggest debates, musical debates of the 1890s was whether, with the composition of the New World Symphony, Dvorak had written an American work. Critics like Henry Krehbiel, James Huneker, W.J. Henderson, and Philip Hale, as well as Amy Beach and many others, crossed swords, if not blood, on these issues. So, oh yay, court in session. Here's the argument for the prosecution in the effort to prove the New World is American. The prosecution begins. See, I wanted to be able to clear my throat, but that's sort of tacky. So I figured if I built a court case in, I could clear, well, anyway, here it goes. In numerous places, the composer Antonin Dvořák made statements about aspects of the symphony's American identity. He called it the New World. He said anyone with a nose could tell the influence of the United States. He told at least 2 critics that the inner movements were based on Longfellow's Song of Hiawatha, and this has been confirmed by scholarly study. So, for example, the famous Largo is associated with a passage on the prairie. There is further an impressive body of evidence that Dvorak modeled African-American songs as he composed, and this evidence comes from somebody known to be a frequent guest at Dvorak's home, Harry Burleigh, though Edward McDowell and others mention it as well. Not only did he encounter, notice, and use African-American songs as he composed, but in a series of articles and statements in the newspaper in the spring of 1893, he made the stunning pronouncement that caught many by surprise that any American music worthy of the name should have African-American song at its very foundation. Dvorak was an experienced musician, and he had encountered many things in his lifetime, but he had never encountered anything that sounded like these African-American songs, and he was stunned by them. He'd never encountered anything so deeply expressive, and as a devout Catholic himself, he was delighted by the fact that these songs, which he took to be America's folk songs, were all about David playing the harp, Daniel and the lion's den. They were biblical instead of Czech folk songs, which were basically about girls and drinking. He loved them, but he was delighted by these things. So taken all together, says the prosecutor, the use of American musical themes, American landscapes, America, flora and fauna, American legends at the very core of this symphony make it a piece of American music. The defense, noting the many people streaming into the courtroom, clears her throat, and she says, let us imagine for the moment that all of these statements are fully accepted by both the scholarly and public musical community, even though later we may come back to quibble about it. Still, what does it mean to be American and write American music? Dvorak considered himself, obviously, to be a Czech. There's a famous statement where he says, reported by his secretary, Kovařík, he says, I used American ideas to show composers what could be done, but I'm not American. I've always been a Czech composer. So if instead of a musician, Dvorak had been a gifted painter, creating works based like Bierstadt's on the mountains and prairies of the West, would that make him an American painter, or at most, a Czech painter whose subject is America. And if we're pleased with ourselves for making this distinction, we're then forced to ask ourselves the further question of whether, perhaps, the subject of the painting or the symphony was not anything American, but rather American subjects were being pressed into service because the real point was to use them to explore the interplay of abstract tone colors and thicker brush strokes, different harmonies. It's music. Who knows what the subject is? Then the defense goes in for the kill and says, so, a question like, is the New World Symphony Czech or American is difficult not only because the term American is poorly defined, and we don't really know whether to be Czech or American as a matter of citizenship, national origin, language, neuropsychology, or DNA, but also because we need facts to prove one argument over the other. And in the end, the defense says, raising her hands in the air, we don't really know what happened in the past, and the more we think about it, the more difficult it gets. The prosecution responds in an exasperated manner with much eye-rolling and returns to the argument. Not only did Dvorak write an American symphony, he wrote it because, and now he pauses for effect, he was contracted to do it. We get back to economics. Jeanette Thurber brought Dvorak to the United States for the express purpose of getting him to write an example of American music for a young and energetic country searching for new directions. We do not argue that there's simply one possible American music, but rather that Dvorak created one kind of American music and named it as such. New World means American, United Statesian, an expression that our fellow countries in South America would actually prefer that we use sometimes. This is American music. It references African American music. It references Native American music and legends. Most of its audience took it as an example of American music. Your Honor, we believe we have proved this case. It's American music. The defense stretches, noting perhaps that Dvorak merely did what he'd done in the past back when he was Czech. She saunters over to a piano that has mysteriously appeared in the courtroom, and she plays. It's a festival of connections. She plays this. Dvorak first encountered when he read it in an article called Negro Music, which had been published in 1892. This was the first piece of notated African-American music he'd seen. But then she notes, she says, you all know Dvorak's oratorio, St. Ludmilla, where there's a passage match in, you know, anytime you're thinking about the exotic, whether it's African American, Native American, Turkish. It's the same thing that comes. This isn't anything particularly American. They're not particularly authentic. And all these things are appearing whenever somebody tries to do something exotic. And she goes further. She says, why do you think Jeanette Thurber chose Dvorak? She assumes an oratorical stance. Dvorak was not chosen because he was a natural Democrat, which he was, and not because he'd worked his way up from poverty, which he had done, and not even because he was a great composer, which is certainly true. Rather, it was Dvorak's Mozartian, protean tendency to assimilate and then combine unlike elements into convincing wholes. The defense attorney notes that Dvorak and Mozart were not the only figures to do this. To some extent, the 19th century was filled with such things. Beethoven's childlike Turkish march in the middle of the vast humanist canvas of the Ninth Symphony finale, which is replete with drinking songs, double fugues, and weird abstractions. Think of the Czech Pilgrim's March in the slow movement of Mendelssohn's Italian Symphony, and the Gypsy finale in the Brahms G minor piano quartet. But more than these others, the defense insists that Dvorak's style was always a style of styles. a genuine Habsburg conflation of argots dialects, from the most aristocratic to the harshly rustic, from the high Victorian style of the oratorios and masses to the cymbalom-infused inflections of the gypsy songs, and from the Smetanian Czech exuberance of the Carnival Overture to the high Austrian internationalism of the F minor trio. Who else could traverse so quickly from Dumki to Slavonic dances and from folk song to fugue? What other composer in Europe at this time could have brought this rich palette and added to it a range of local styles, both real and imaginary? This explains, members of the jury, both how quickly Dvorak could move to an American accent and why some insisted that this was really the same kind of music he always wrote. He had just stuck another arrow in his very Czech and European quiver. Objection from the prosecution. If indeed Dvorak combined all these unlike elements, as the defense says, it would be a recipe for incoherence, a musical mess, and a sonic mishap. The defense, perhaps a New Yorker, offers this description of the great cathedral at St. John the Divine. The cathedral reflects a hodgepodge of architectural styles, with a Gothic nave, a Romanesque crossing under the dome, chapels in French, English, and Spanish Gothic styles, as well as Norman and Byzantine, Gothic choir stalls, and Roman arches and columns. The defense notes that this stylistic mix even applies to the stained glass windows, whose subject matter ranges from saints to swordsmen and from bishops to baseball players, the famous sports window. The point, she says, isn't whether you can point to different styles, but how they're integrated by the energy and intellect of the composer. The stomachs of the jurors are rumbling, and the judge asks for preliminary findings. After a brief recess of 6 months, where the jury spends every day sequestered in a cheap New Jersey motel with torn carpets, there is a decision. While Dvorak undoubtedly used a wide and impressive range of elements he found in the United States in composing his New World Symphony, especially a deep and abiding reliance on African-American musical models, it cannot be said precisely whether this is American music, because we actually don't know what such a thing means. But in a surprise move, the jurors also add that after sitting around for half a year, they don't really know if Dvorak is a Czech composer either, for the same reasons. Some think he might be an Austro-Hungarian composer, and others that he might actually be a European composer. But in the end, all happily agree that at the very least he was a composer. So the judge considers, and this part is called celebration versus investigation, it's the boring part. The depleted jurors have gone home, and the judge and lawyers are just sitting around having a desultory conversation about Dvorak. The judge says, let's imagine that a particular figure like Dvorak is worthy to be disseminated. In the case of the music, worthy to be heard. We decide this based on our own evaluation, but also the valuations of others. The individual turns into a collective. The collective says this is valuable. So how do we deal with them? We have, says the judge, I believe, two diametrically opposed ways of presenting this thing to others, through celebration or investigation. While these may overlap in places and sometimes seem to be consonant, they're in fact mostly opposing activities. Celebration's a matter of advocacy. The purpose is to make the strongest possible case at all times for the figure, work, or artifact in question. So we hear celebratory statements like, Beethoven not only remade the image of the artist in society, but by his intellectual courage, reformulated the very notion of how a composer was supposed to work. Or, it was Dvorak more than any other figure who grasped the essence of the American musical experience. Such phrases can be couched in the language of academic certainty, but they're essentially stump speeches resistant to anything like evidential proof and not wanting it. Who uses this kind of language anyway, says the prosecution. Judge answers, agents and managers, orchestral organizations and opera houses. Welcome to Janacek's world, says the Metropolitan Opera. Writers of music history textbooks, but really we all do to some extent. We can't help it. While for some, such locutions are a result of economic necessity, people who make a living filling concert halls. For many people, listeners and scholars, these composers are their heroes, their gods, and it's simply natural to speak in such a way. To some people, things like the New World Symphony are such amazing and inexplicable gifts that celebrating them and their creators seems the only logical process, aside from engaging them in concert halls and recordings. But what, the judge continues, if as a result of one's interest in a particular aspect of a composer's work, someone wants to investigate rather than celebrate? And what if one further concludes that this process should, in general, follow the laws of both the scientific method and a court of law? In other words, it must not be a matter of advocacy and special pleading, but must be something like dispassionate, objective, and seek verifiable processes, basing statements on available facts and methods. Investigation insists that one make a distinction between what one believes and what one knows, and one doesn't like to do that. The defense has been sitting quietly, appearing to be asleep, but she interjects. It's a little more complicated than that. I would submit that there are at least two fundamental types of investigation, one somewhat in keeping with the instinct to celebrate, and the other its polar opposite. The first of these involves investigations of a range of matters related to the composer or the work. What kind of paper is the manuscript written on? Is that note an E or an E flat? Did the composer really stop in Pilsen on the way to Detroit, or was it rather Zanzibar? So to make something up, when a member of the audience in Cincinnati at the first performance of the New World cries, "Saddle," was he saying Anton Seidel, or was he actually using the word saddle in reference to the rural aspects of the symphony? All these are questions which, while not celebratory in themselves, would rarely, if ever, bring us into any conflict with any basic or larger idea and never challenge the veneration. Exactly, says the judge. It's those other questions that get us going. What was Dvorak's relationship to Wagner? Why wasn't Dvorak at the first public performance of the New World Symphony? Is the New World Symphony really a work on the level with a Beethoven symphony? What did Dvorak really think of women composers? How much beer did Dvorak drink? Now, it's not that any of these questions need to bring us into conflict with the instinct to celebrate. It's more that they might. Let's imagine for a moment what kind of investigator we want. If, for an example, an independent commission were set up to explore the pending court case that I began with today, most of us would want this body to work neither for the interests of one party or the other, but simply to ask questions and seek answers according to their principles and a series of best practices. Depending on those answers, other questions might arise, and we would wish that investigative body to continue to be able and free to ask any of those questions as well, and so forth. In other words, to investigate certain kinds of questions freely in our business, one must be ready to wade into controversy. One doesn't look for it, but if it comes, one can't stop in the interests of advocacy. Of course, in the case of any investigation related to Dvorak, there's not the same kind of pressure that there is in a court of law. Courts of law have to arrive at a judgment, and after that, the matter is dropped. But we can stop investigating without penalty anytime we want. And even if we keep going, our research often results in the humanistic equivalent of a mistrial. Because sooner or later, we get into areas of such complexity and intellectual knot-tying that a step in any direction seems to take us further away from our destination. For once, says the prosecution, I agree with the arguments made by the defense. It turns out that knowing anything is savagely difficult, which is another reason why celebration often seems preferable. When we do research, we confront any number of paradoxes. While in an inquiry, the number of things we know may be amazingly vast, or at least large enough to make our brains think that we have complete coverage, this is a dangerous misunderstanding. In reality, what we need to know in any inquiry is a perilous fraction of what we actually do know. So while we may have hundreds of various records from Dvorak's American years, we probably have references to about a billionth of the composer's time in the United States. Not only do we have scant references to real-time activities, but even our broad brush understandings are shaky. When did Dvorak meet the African-American singer Henry Burley first and hear him sing funerals? Did he hear him sing all kinds of things? Spirituals, plantation songs. Was it October? Was it January? Was it March? We don't know. And we may never know. So, says the prosecutor, let's just enjoy the music, which we can never understand or explain completely, celebrate it with festivals and praise, none of this downer stuff, revisionist approach that seeks to knock a figure off their pedestal. This happens basically because most critics and musicologists wouldn't know what to do with a pedestal if they got near it. The defense, who's been wrinkling her brow over the last few minutes, finally speaks. So it turns out, perversely, she says, that history turns out to be the art of figuring out what didn't happen. Or to put it another way, historical investigation is the art of using evidence to find out what happened, then trying to imagine all those things that might have happened for which there is no evidence, and on top of that, trying to imagine what didn't happen. And after that, if you have any energy left, you have to try to put it all in an almost infinite layer of context. The natural progression in serious historical investigation is generally from greater to lesser certainty, even as one arguably has much more information at one's disposal. She reaches into her bag and pulls out a volume, and while turning pages, she continues. There are many reasons why we seem to recede from that which we wish to know, some of which I've suggested above. But at its core is the reality that the historical moment is infinitely richer than any memory of it. The combination of physical sensations, mental life, observation in a given instant is infinitely rich. Our memory of it is simply determined by the size of our brain and its storage capacity. Once something happens, it's gone. She finds the right place in her book. She says, this is a quote from the great philosopher Jean Améry, whose At the Mind's Limits is one of the best books that's ever been written about what it was like to be in a concentration camp. Améry wrote, one can devote an entire life to comparing the imagined and the real and still never accomplish anything by it. And we agree, one of the greatest differences in the universe is from something as we imagine it and something that really happened. Yes, says the defense, enforced celebration always destroys investigation. If the only possible answer to any question is Dvorak was a god, there is no investigation. The judge says, let's find a test case in order to determine what we might be able to know and what's impossible. Picking at random, he says, let's look at the finale of the New World Symphony. He notes that the finale is an odd kind of musical creature. Neither the goal of the work's trajectory, like the famous last movement of Beethoven's Ninth, or perhaps even the Jupiter Symphony, but on the other hand, not any kind of throwaway, or now it's over. It occupies a kind of middle ground. In most recordings, almost all, it's the longest movement after the largo and filled with vivid and captivating musical images. A sound system mysteriously appears in the courtroom. The judge says, let's begin by playing two of those images and asking people to listen for detail. It sounds like it's going to be loud. Let's see. Exhibit 1, says the judge. Here's Exhibit 2. The judge says, as I'm sure you can hear, sauntering over to the keyboard. The first example proceeds as a kind of dramatic trumpet fanfare in a kind of A-B-A-C form. So you have A, B, A again. And then surprise. So you have a fanfare at the end. It's a simple format. In the second iteration, however, there's no fanfare, it disappears, and it tails off into quietude. So what's the account for this? How do we account for these differences, and can they help answer any of our questions? Can they get us somehow beyond celebration? Well, says the prosecution, as part of the process, we have to put these examples in context. The formal structure of such a movement is often described as, excuse me? The judge finds that political appointees he didn't make are suddenly in charge of the Senate. No, he didn't. So the prosecution says, you have to understand, in order to interpret this, that Dvorak is using a procedure of composition that's usually known as sonata form. That means we have a main theme preceded, of course, by a short introduction. That's the main theme. It establishes the key, it establishes the tone, and that's what you'd expect in a piece like this. As P.D.Q. Bach would say, it's what you get in all your best symphonies. And then, of course, after this, there's something like a transition. This brings us to a second theme that by design is radically different in every way from the character of the opening. If the opening is forceful and aggressive and loud, this is soft and yielding, imaginary. And again, as in everything from Eine Kleine to Beethoven's Fifth, there's a closing passage. And this is followed in the symphonic model by the part that sometimes is considered the most important part, the part that gives it its identity, it makes it Western music, et cetera, the development section where materials from the other parts of the piece, and in this particular other parts of other movements are sort of put together in various formats. And here's a little snippet of the development. So Dvorak's simply using a normal symphonic model, and the part that was pointed to earlier is what happens after the development, which is the main theme, comes back. Big deal. So, this is based on mainstream formal models. Dvorak's using a sonata design. Big deal. The defense, who's been listening intently, furrowing her brow, speaks up saying that, in fact, what is supposed to be a return actually, if you listen, sounds more like a conclusion than the beginning of anything. So how do we account for the difference between the return, which is supposed to be the same in many ways as what you heard at the beginning? Why is it so different? The judge interrupts to note that while we can never say precisely what a musical idea is in words, we can often easily say what it is not. He suggests that both attorneys would agree that if the opening of the movement depicts something, it's unlikely to be déjeuner sur l'herbe or a joyous and pious Christmas scene. Whatever it is meant to suggest, it is something powerful, even aggressive. If it is not a battle cry explicitly, it is something very much like it. Correct, says the defense, but in the return, not only is the confident fanfare missing, but after one statement of the theme, its character changes completely. Something happens to it. The prosecutor, not fond of discussions of musical character, suggests that there are several purely musical explanations for this. He says it's well known that Dvorak was always conversing for his contemporaries and suggests that it could be just like Beethoven. So the opening of Beethoven's Fifth, and then the continuation. But the second time round, so, says the prosecution, by changing the nature of the idea when it returns, he's simply having a chat with Beethoven. There's nothing special about that. And even if it's not omaggio to Beethoven, Dvorak's still creating these shapes for purely musical reasons. Some kind of instinct tells him that in the abstract world of musical storytelling, he needs a respite after the heightened power of the music that precedes the main idea. So here's the music that precedes the main idea. Fake return. Real return. So the prosecution says the differences between the two simply respond to the local activity of the symphony at that point. Dvorak's instincts tell him that after that very powerful return that he has to pull back. The defense is unconvinced. Perhaps she has some new evidence. She begins slowly. How do we describe this music? Is it simply pure sonic drama, as the prosecution said, creating what we used to call heightened tension through the combination of harmonic certainty, increase in volume, and general instability? Or is there another explanation for some of the choices Dvorak made? She reaches again into her briefcase, pulls out a few sheets of paper, exhibits A and B, she calls them, saying that in departure from his usual practice, the composer took great pains to tell critics and audience that the middle movements of the symphony were based on passages from Longfellow's Hiawatha. It's all right here in black and white, she says. The prosecution is impatient. But Dvorak said nothing about the finale. You just can't make something up that isn't there. Bear with me, says the defense. There are other kinds of evidence as well. For example, we know that after composing the two epic bookends of his American period, the New World Symphony and the Cello Concerto, Dvorak never again wrote an orchestral work that didn't have a story attached to it. In fact, in the last 9 years of his life, he wrote nothing but operas and tone poems. And we know that when he wrote the first of these tone poems, he wrote the words from the poem into the first draft as if it were a kind of melodrama. So close was the association between the declaimed text and the musical sound. So what kind of thing is this finale? Is it a full-fledged symphonic movement, as the prosecution says, or is it really some kind of tone poem? And if it's a tone poem, how do we find out what the subject is? This is just reaching, says the prosecution, and the judge seems to be nodding in assent. You just can't muck about until you find something you think fits the music. It's complicated, says the defense. But we're dealing with evidence in the best way we can. Is it likely that after creating two movements of the New World, richly showing scenes from Hiawatha, that Dvorak completely abandoned it in the finale while still using the same themes from those movements? But look at this, she says. The strange and distorted return of the main theme is the same kind of thing himself noted in a famous article in the New York Herald on December 15th, 1893. Remember, speaking about the Largo, which he refers to in this as an adagio, he says, the second movement of my new symphony is an adagio, but it's different from the classic works in this form. It's really a study or sketch for a longer work, either a cantata or opera, which I propose writing, which will be based on Longfellow's Song of Hiawatha. I've long had the idea of utilizing that poem. So we've agreed that the opening brass music with its concluding fanfare is something like a war cry, and there is such a place in the Song of Hiawatha, and it's even part of a written scenario that Dvorak received when he was writing a libretto for it. It is the final battle between Hiawatha and Pau-Puk-Keewis. Pau-Puk-Keewis, you may remember, is the evil genius of the Ojibwe who does a fabulous dance at Hiawatha's wedding. He's a creative artist, but he's also a very big-time troublemaker, like some artists, irresponsible, not a statesman. And Hiawatha's the good statesman, and Pau-Puk-Keewis can't stand it. He's always been jealous of Hiawatha, resents Hiawatha's maturity and status, and so when Hiawatha leaves for a while, Pau-Puk-Keewis does the worst thing he can imagine doing. As you may remember from your Disney films, Hiawatha talks to animals, and Pau-Puk-Keewis kills all Hiawatha's animals, especially the mountain chickens, who are his favorite pets. And, says the defense, I think these lines go along with that music. Full of wrath was Hiawatha when he came into the village, found the people in confusion, heard of all the misdemeanors, all the malice and the mischief of the cunning Pau-Puk-Keewis. Through his teeth he buzzed and muttered words of anger and resentment. I will slay this Pau-Puk-Keewis, slay this mischief maker. Not so long and wide the world that my wrath shall not attain him. I will slay this Pau-Puk-Keewis, slay this mischief maker. Not so long and wide the world that my wrath shall not attain him. Then in swift pursuit departed Hiawatha and all the hunters on the trail of Pau-Puk-Keewis. And aloud cried Hiawatha, standing on the summit of the mountain, not so long and wide the world, not so rude and rough, but my wrath shall overtake you, and my vengeance shall attain you. Pau-Puk-Keewis running away. Over rock and over river, through bush and brake and forest ran the cunning Pau-Puk-Keewis. Like an antelope, he bounded till he came into a streamlet in the middle of a forest, to a streamlet still and tranquil that had overflowed its margin. Over rock and over river, through bush and brake and forest ran the cunning Pau-Puk-Keewis. Like an antelope he bounded. Then he comes to a dam, stands looking in. The water comes up over his ankles. Flowed the bright and silvery water. And he spoke to a beaver who bubbled up. And he said, cool and pleasant is the water. Let me dive into the water. Let me rest there in your lodge. Change me too into a beast. And there's more, she says. That it explains exactly what Dvorak is doing and why the return of the main theme is very, very different than what you hear at the beginning. Because in this scene, Paupakiwis says the defense turned himself into a beaver, but Hiawatha continued to pursue him. So he turned himself into a bird. Hiawatha continued to pursue him. And then Paupakiwis took refuge in a mountain. There without stood Hiawatha, smote great caverns in the sandstone. Hiawatha cried aloud in tones of thunder, "Open! I am Hiawatha!" But the old man of the mountain opened not, and made no answer from the silent crags of sandstone. "Open! I am Hiawatha!" Then he raised his hand to heaven, called imploring on the tempest, called Wewasimo the lightning, and the thunder Animiki, and they came with night and darkness, sweeping down the big sea water from the distant thunder mountains, and the trembling Paupakiwis heard the footsteps of the thunder, saw the red eyes of the lightning, was afraid and crouched and trembling. Then Wewasimo the lightning smote the doorways of the caverns, with his war club smote the doorways, smote the jutting crags of sandstone, and the thunder Animiki shouted down into the cavern, saying, "Where is Paupakiwis?" And the crags fell. And beneath them, dead among the rocky ruins, lay the cunning Paupakiwis, lay the handsome Yenadize, slain in his own human figure. Very nice, says the prosecution, clapping ironically. Lots of storm and fury, but really it proves nothing. You're assuming that Dvorak is using music to illustrate the text, but he doesn't include the text. Only a few nerdy musicologists know it. He's clearly using the text to generate abstract sonic patterns. When you cleverly combine them, it sounds as if they belong together, but Dvorak's New World has done perfectly well all these years without your melodrama. And it raises other questions. If we suddenly know what this passage means, what about the other passages in the movement for which we have found no text? Are they suddenly less meaningful? The defense bristles. Trying to understand the sources of the music of a great composer is part of the natural curiosity of the investigator. Besides, how do you know what Dvorak really wanted to do in the end, what he really wanted us to find? The judge, who has been nodding one way or the other, sagely clears his throat. There are many issues here we're not hearing about. Yes, I'm willing to agree that the passage you have played is maybe some kind of storm, but what kind of storm? Is it about Hiawatha, or does the composer use Hiawatha as a pretext? Does the storm have other sources? Could it be a philosophical storm? The defense, who's by now a bit put out after all that effort, says Dvorak was not known to be much of a philosopher. Well, says the prosecution, perhaps not in words, but he's certainly a kind of philosopher in music. In the end, says the judge, the storm might even be personal. After all, Dvorak, like all human beings, had a rich inner life of drama and struggle, even if his outward appearance was one of stability and tranquility. In New York, he's missing his children, trying to decide whether to come out as a composer of program music, risking the ire of his greatest supporters like Brahms and Hanslick, Joachim. He struggles at times with anxiety and stress. The storm can be that as well. At this point, the cleaning crew comes in, and without any deference to the exalted rank of the judge and the lawyer, says, "Hey, you guys got to get out of here." The judge says, "One last moment. I have something like a final statement to make." The judge says, "I've listened for quite some time, and I'd now like to happily conclude these legal proceedings, drawing on a paradox introduced at the beginning, that the New World Symphony is many things, including a sacred icon, a source of information, an economic and legal res, or thing, all rolled into one. We admit the symphony is both American and not American, and that we really don't know what this means, and that the passage we considered from the finale is many things, including a storm called forth by Hiawatha as Prospero to vanquish Paupakiwis, a storm that may represent Dvorak's own conflicts, a piece of abstract sound inspired by the idea of a storm, and also possibly none of the above. And while I'm happy to conclude that both celebration and investigation have their place when we think about the New World and its sources, I was struck by an article I saw in the paper last week. The judge pulls out the article. A Chinese journalist who wrote about a former civil servant who kept sex slaves was detained by security agents who accused him of revealing state secrets. He responded, the journalist, "I was only thinking about how to make my story as accurate as possible and satisfy the public's right to know, but I discovered soon that I failed to address the most important issue, face." The fate of composers like Dvorak cannot, alas, be left only to those who wish to celebrate his legacy or those who believe that investigation should be limited to abstract score analysis and clearing up a few historical details. All those who celebrate should be urged to investigate as well, to ask questions, and to ignore those who believe that somehow one must save face when one writes the history of a national hero. So let the investigations be open and broad, and let the questions be challenging and even troubling. That's the way scientific and music studies, too, move forward. And of course, there is another thing. Celebration and investigation are not our only options. We can combine them both in something we call contemplation, which links our experience of listening with careful and thoughtful consideration. And then the judge and attorneys get up and leave the room, leaving me here. And I promised you at the end that I would say something about the economic value of the New World manuscript. By ruling that the Czech artworks that they could be confiscated, the court originally determined that national art could potentially serve as compensation for a government debt, and therefore that national art had a cash value, and a considerable one at that. So theoretically, our manuscript could be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But the court reversed its decision recently in the summer, suggesting that actually, as national treasures, such things are never for sale and cannot serve as economic hostages. In some sense, this removes such things as artworks and manuscripts from an economic realm and places them even more firmly into a separate space, one arguably even more difficult to comprehend. This reminded me of a wonderful story by Carroll called Chintamani and Birds, Chintamani and Ptazzi, and made into a wonderful film called The Chintamani and the Swindler. You remember this? A man obsessed with Oriental carpets notices under a particular fat poodle in a grungy antique store an amazing carpet, a chintamani with sacred bird patterns to keep up our theme of birdsong. All he wants is to get his hands on it. He even goes to England to visit the leading authority on carpets. He asks him, "How much would a rug with this pattern be at this size?" The expert responds, "It's worth nothing because no such thing exists." "But what if it did exist?" ask the collectors. "It would still be impossible to value," the expert responds, "because it is unique, and what is unique cannot be valuated." So according to this approach, in economic terms, the value of our missing manuscript is simultaneously infinite and non-existent, in its own way consistent with the latest court ruling. Fortunately, as you'll see in the next presentation, the true value of the manuscript lies in many other areas, most of which can be happily accessed without the iconic presence of the original. Thank you very much.
So, dear ladies and gentlemen, I'm very happy to be here, and I want to thank you, Mrs. Barbara Karpetová from the Czech Embassy, who invited me. I want to thank Mike for such a nice lecture, and I also want to thank you to Library of Congress. I won't play any music, but I will show you some pictures of some subjects from our collection. But firstly, I have to introduce also my institution that I work for and describe in more detail the theme of my presentation titled Manuscripts as Storytellers. So firstly, the Antonin Dvořák Museum has its residence in a very small building, but I can tell you that's exactly the largest museum in the Czech Republic. And why? Because our museum is a part of National Museum. So we started with the logo of National Museum. Then it comes Czech Museum of Music. It's a department because there are a lot of museums like Natural Museum or History Museum or Náprstek Museum, which belongs also to the National Museum. So then there is this big museum, and department of this Czech Museum of Music is our Antonin Dvořák Museum. So it is quite complicated, but this is the whole name, and this is our building. So it was just a small presentation. And what is the mission of the museum? Just as musicians continually attend to composers' legacies by performing their music, so museums contribute to this care by striving for the maximum possible preservation of composers' material lyrics. It may seem that when it comes to music, this material part is much less important than, for instance, in the case of a painter legacy. After all, the point is that the music is performed, played, heard, and it has been done for a long time from new printed edition. So perhaps we do not need these autographs, these manuscripts. But a collection of items, however, can tell incredible stories which complete the image of a composer as a human being and bring a number of stimuli on all eras of research. In the case of Antonin Dvořák, we are really fortunate in that over the period of more than 100 years that have passed since his death, almost all significant Dvořák documents have been successfully gathered within a single institution. This factor means an immense advantage for the composer's reception. And this institution is, of course, our Dvořák Museum. So this is really very nice that we have the access to most of the Dvořák documents, to the autographs, and that is also the reason that I can present some of them to you. So, as I said, the residence of the museum is this nice Baroque villa, which is called America, but it is not because of Dvořák. I can tell you that Dvořák was never there in this building. He lived not very far from this house, but he was never there. And this is called America because there was a restaurant with this name America in the 19th century. People. And I just have to tell you something about the history of the museum because this is really close connected to the collection. The museum was founded in 1932 by the Society for the Erection of a Monument to the Maestro Antonin Dvořák, and later became the society, Antonin Dvořák Society. Since its origination, it has resided in Prague, in this Villa America, which was created by the architect Kilian Ignaz Dietzenhofer at the beginning of the 18th century. A short time previously, the society had acquired for the future museum as a gift from the composer's widow, Mrs. Anna Dvořáková, various items from his original study. It was his viola, a piano, several pieces of furniture, including the writing desk, or also the gown Dvořák wore at the ceremony in Cambridge. And these two things are also today one of the main items in the Dvořák exhibition at the museum. So really Dvořák worked at this table and he played this piano. But I can tell you there are not so many things like this. Most of items in our collections are paper documents. What was the further fate of the museum? It was quite typical fate and typical story of similar institutions in the Czechoslovakia. In 1956, the existence of a private or non-governmental institution was no more possible because of the communism regime, and the state overtook this museum, and later on in 1976 it became a part of a national museum, and this is the story I've already told you. So it has its advantage because a great institution, such a national museum, was really very successful to acquire a lot of things for the collection. And really this collection is now truly unique due to its integrity and records. And really, later on, I'll give you an example of another Czech composer who is not so lucky like Dvořák. So, what does the collection contain? The Antonin Dvořák Museum collection contains approximately 8,000 items of various types, thus being the largest collection of Dvořák documents in the world. But I can tell you there are another really several thousands of items, mainly from the personal effects of two distinguished Dvořák scholars, Otakar Šourek and Jaromír Burghauser, which have not been catalogued to date. So I think there are a lot of interesting documents, perhaps not Dvořák documents, but related more to the reception of Dvořák. Yet the significance of the collection rests not in its size, but in its uniqueness and concentrated character. As you can see, the collection comprises iconographies, scores, reproductions, reception documents, like programs, posters, audiovisual materials. Here we can see also a picture of Tchaikovsky with a dedication to Dvořák. In Russia, Mojímu drugu, to my friend. There is also a cigarette case or a book, a diary of Dvořák with a list of his work. So we can see also here z Nového světa, from the New World. So really very precious things. But what is the most important thing we have? These are the autographs. Autographs, manuscripts, and also correspondence. There are more than 2,000 of letters. And the possibility to explore the autographs is absolutely essential, especially for researchers and editors of new Dvořák editions. So my colleagues from the Czech Academy of Science in the Czech Republic, they work on this project since 1999, and they prepare new complete edition of Dvořák works. And really they appreciated that they have all these documents in one institution. And this is quite important also in the Czech Republic, because if you have the materials in the state or governmental institution, they must be shown and provided to researchers. So they must. So if you come to Prague and if you would like to study Dvořák documents, we will provide you with them. In private museums and collections, there is no such a rule, but in our museum it is. And I can give you an example of this another Czech composer, as I mentioned, who is not so lucky, and these researchers are also not so lucky. This is Bohuslav Martinů, Czech composer from the 20th century, with a similar fate like Dvořák. He spent also several years in America, created all his symphonies here, and spent several other years in other countries in Europe. And it means, and he never returned to the Czech Republic or Czechoslovakia, it was no more possible. And his documents and autographs are scattered in 17 institutions in a lot of countries. So it's a really big problem, and I know it quite a lot because I used to work at the Martinů Institution and was by the preparation of Martinů, new critical edition, and really it's a big problem. So in Dvorak we are quite happy to have it in one house. But the situation in the case of Dvorak and the new edition is sometimes also not so easy if we have, even if we have all these materials in our house. Because the editors found out that the main source for the preparation of the new edition needn't necessarily be the composer's autograph score, but the copies written in someone else's hand, or prints, or transcriptions, or performing materials from the premieres, and so on and so on. And these materials are not all of them in our house. A lot of them are, of course, here in America. So sometimes it's also not easy in the case of Dvořák. And stories of manuscripts. Accordingly, when dealing with philological problems, an autograph is not the only, and in some cases, most essential source. And I know that my colleagues from the Dvořák editions try to solve questions like this. Why did Dvořák use some peculiar notation symbols in his autographs? What was their meaning? Why do many of the individual peculiarities vanish in the print edition? What in an autograph may be regarded as sloppiness and what as deliberate? Who were the transcribers of a Dvořák work? Who wrote out the parts for orchestra players, opera singers? Who is concealed behind this or that cipher? Is this or that transcription reliable, and so on and so on? So many questions if you watch the autographs. But, and you can see that inspecting the autographs can bring less satisfaction and raise more questions. But during my next presentation of the autographs of Dvořák's works dating from his American period, I do not want to bother you with this. And therefore I will completely avoid seeking answers to these questions that I mentioned, and I will introduce these manuscripts as storytellers. Because music autographs do not only provide music information, they also splendidly document the circumstances in which a work originated. Let us begin with the autograph of the most famous and most popular Dvořák work, Symphony No. 9 from the New World. So there's a print. Yeah, I've chosen this print because it's the first print with the dedication of Dvořák. You can see here. Dedicated to Emanuel Chvála, friend of Dvořák. But we can see from the New World, aus der Neuen Welt in Germany, and we can find normally here not, because it's the first print and it was a different story, but normally we find it's symphony and it's number 9. But if we watch the autograph, we can observe that Dvořák didn't title the work as symphony, but as Sinfonia. I asked Mike how to pronounce it, if there is a difference. So not symphony, but like this more Italian pronunciation, sinfonia. And this fact was really in the literature entirely missed out. The majority of the literature uniformly uses the term symphony, whereas the German musicologist Klaus Dege refers to it as merely Sinfonia. So why? In German, it is possible to consider the two terms to be synonymous. Also in the dictionary MGG, Musik in Geschichte und Gegenwart, the entry Sinfonia in this version is entirely dismissed with a reference to the entry symphony. In the New Grove, there are both of them. And in Czech language, we know that this Sinfonia is rather linked with the musical production of the 17th and 18th century. And symphony is rather linked with the, connected with the romantic type and performance in the 19th century. So the use of the terms appears to be extremely vague, which is also confirmed in the case of Dvořák. We know that he titled Sinfonia his 2nd, 7th, 8th, and 9th symphony. And most of the first symphonies he titled Symphony. So I try to find out if there is a rule or something like that, but there is no, and I just asked also Mike what he thinks, but really I think there was no purpose to design it like this. And here we have the symphony, the symphony number 4, or later on it was number 5. And we can see that on the first page of this symphony, he used both of these terms. Symphony and here symphonia. So Dvořák himself makes all the speculations even more obscure by using both of the terms in his correspondence or on a single page of an autograph. So I think there is no solution for this problem, but that's also the story which can we see on the manuscripts. Furthermore, we can see that the number 9 is not evident at all on the title page on this celebrated Symphony number 9 from the New World. So we can see there's number 8, and Dvořák crossed it out, and there's 7 strange. This shift, as against the current numbering, originated back in the 60s, when Dvořák deemed his first symphony lost, and when composing the next symphony, he began numbering again from the number 1. But this first symphony was discovered then many years later. Another interesting piece of information is contained in the list of the composer's previous symphonies on the left side on the title page. Under the Symphony 3, but today it's number 4, as I already told you, there is a thick blue line. This could mean division of the symphonies that were printed, which is also noted in the score, including the specific names of the publishers. Here, Simrock, Nobel, Simrock again. But it might also express Dvořák's clear opinion and evaluation of his own symphonies. In a number 4 from 1874, the composer made a clearly audibly change in the compositional style, and we know about this change also from his correspondence or from his expressions. And it is possible that he wanted to indicate it also this change of style with this line, because I do not know another reason. So this title page of the autograph has told us no fewer than 3 stories the story of the intricacy of generic designation, the problem with the numbering of Dvořák symphonies, and indication of the composer's evaluation of his own symphonies. So perhaps it was not so funny, but I can show you something what is really very nice. That's the last page from this New World Symphony. What we can find there, except the wonderful music. Here is thanks to God. We can find it in almost all scores. And then the concerto ended, and then here the children, it is in Czech, the children arrived in Southampton, 1:33 p.m., the telegram received. So really, I love it very much. Dvořák completed his symphony during the first year of his sojourn in America, when only some of his family were with him. Just two of his 6 children and his wife, but 4 of his children had stayed at home, and after 8 months, they finally set out to join the rest of the family in the USA. And Dvořák couldn't wait to see them, and when he found out that they had arrived in the English seaport, he noted it down in the symphony score. So there are 2 another pieces, American Flag and Te Deum, which are being considered as American works. But I will show you that they are, or they cannot be, such an American. Why? Because he created them before his departure for America. The composition Dvořák finished shortly before going to America, before starting the work on the New World Symphony, is the cantata for solo, tenor and bass, chorus and orchestra, opus 102, the American Flag. The opus number may lead us to consider that the American Flag originated after the New World Symphony. Yet Dvořák began working on this piece, bearing an American title, and composed to an English text prior to his leaving for the USA, which he literally confirmed by his own note at the end of the complete sketch to the entire work. Let's have a look. Vysoká v září, in September 1892, před odjezdem do Ameriky, before leaving for America. So it's well known to Mike, but the next example, Te Deum. This is the similar case. The title page of the score contains the following words: Hymnus Te Deum Laudamus for soprano and bass solo, chorus and orchestra, composed to honor the memory of Columbus, which will be celebrated in New York on October 12, 1892 by Antonin Dvořák. So yet the work was actually written prior to Dvořák's arrival in the USA, as evidenced by the note at the end of the complete sketch. So you can see Vysoká, 26 June 1892. So again, the same case. He celebrated Columbus, but in Vysoká. So again, to the first page. The score of Te Deum again contains confusing information. this time pertaining to the opus designation, which Dvořák duly explains. Here, partitura, so in Czech, the overture Othello has already been published under number 93. This opus number will have to be changed when it is printed. And he wrote in pencil the suggestion 102. Yet this number had already been given to the American flag, as I already shown you. So Te Deum was eventually published as opus 103. So we can see that in the case of Dvořák, the opus numbers do not reflect the chronology of the works origination, but rather that of their publication. The next example is from the very famous cycle Humoresques. He wrote this cycle in the summer of 1894 when he came back to spend his holiday in his homeland. However, at the end of one of the Humoresques, he wrote the American address here. So I didn't succeed to find out who is it, but I like it very much that he used also the score sometimes where there was a need as a normal paper. He had no other paper, so really you can find quite a lot of things in this course, not only music. Next quite interesting thing. We have seen that the compositions written in America or for America often bear an English or Czech English title. A different case is Silent Wood, it is called in English Silent Wood, a piece also written in America, yet from the very beginning intended for Dvořák's German publisher. So this is documented by the headline, Silent Wood, a piece for cello with orchestra accompaniment in Czech and German. So Klid, die Ruhe. And then the composition you have also skladba and so on, and Stück 4 und so weiter und so fort. So you can see it was written for a German publisher and he didn't intend it to perform it firstly in America. There is also a cover of this composition, but this was certainly not inscribed by Dvořák. Why? Firstly, it is entirely in German, and just the Czech title is in brackets, and Dvořák wouldn't do it, never. And secondly, the composer is referred to here as Anton instead of Antonin. And this Anton, this is a German version of Antonin, and Dvořák fought with his German publisher Simrock against this Germanized variant of his first name many times, referring to the fact that in America they wrote his name correctly as Antonin. So therefore he gave preference to the neutral abbreviation Ant and dot, better than this Anton. So I don't know who wrote this, but definitely not Dvořák. Another piece for cello that was composed in America, this is the Rondo, was intended for Simrock too, which is also shown by the information written in pencil about the copyright on the first notation page. So here we can see again Czech and German explanation, and here really copyright Simrock. So it was dedicated to Simrock and intended just for him for the first time. Yet new works originated in America not only through actually composing, but also as a result of revising. An absolutely unique case is the essential revision of the opera Dimitri, which Dvořák decided to get around to 13 years after the work had originated. So we can read this information on the first page of the opera. So, after 13 years, 1881 composed in Bohemia, 1894 revised in America, and then Novae, you can see the third line, new and newly drawn up scenes and, above all, bolder instrumentation of the opera. So the fact that revising and correcting of opera scores was a common practice of Dvořák is documented by the reminiscence of his pupil Petr Mareš. I quote, Dvořák's visit to Mr. Elznic, the National Theatre archivist, were interesting. He would browse through a score of a young Czech composer, read it for a long time, and run this finger along his coat as tough it were a piano, then piece up and down the room, shake his head, and finally say, listen, my dear Elznic, if someone had told me to write 7 operas, I would have done it. But I certainly wouldn't have been able to write a score as clearly as this one, with no deletions and no crossings out. So it was quite typical for Dvořák that he make a lot of revision, and that we can find a lot of pieces to delete or to cross out and so on. But really, this Dimitri is quite extreme. The original version, there's no more the original version, and this first version has been only preserved in print and performance materials. But the actual score was transformed into another opera. And you can see the Dvořák stretch out, paste it over, and cut out entire pages of the score, to which he attached new pages. We can observe it also on the different types of papers. And on this example, we can see no fewer than 5 layers of paper. So Dvořák does not only let himself be seized by inspiration in the USA, which we can observe in the dozens of ideas captured in his American sketchbooks, he also sat down to a really big task, revising his grand opera. And in conclusion, I would like to draw your attention to one page of the American String Quartet, Opus 96, which Dvořák sketched within 3 days in Spellville, where he felt very well, and we can see, or I know it that there is, you can see. How beautifully shines the sun. So really he enjoyed the Spellville and the atmosphere. So all these examples show us that Dvořák was definitely inspired by America, and I can quote a very nice sentence from a letter of Antonin Dvořák to his friend Emil Kozane. I know I would never have written these works the way I did if I hadn't seen America. And therefore, we prepared also a small exhibition in the room behind, and you can observe their documents and facsimile of manuscripts from Dvořák's American period. In the first box, you can see some cabin tickets from the ship, and I can tell you what Dvořák wrote about his trip. It was his first time also on the ship. Everything is so interesting and beautiful. Let me begin with the trip. It lasted 9 days at sea, and we had nice weather the whole time except for one ugly day. It was very stormy and took more than 24 hours until the ocean calmed, but then we had lovely weather all the way to New York. My wife, the children, and Mr. Kovařík were ill, so for about 2 days they didn't eat anything. Only I, praise God, remained well for the whole trip. And you will see also the picture of Prague station, and today it is Masaryk station, and you know that Dvořák had a passion for trains, and it was this station which led him to England and then to America. Then there is a box about Spillville. Spillville, place in Iowa, when he spent several months with Mr. Kovařík, who was something like his secretary in America, and this Czech-American village really inspired him and brought him a lot of inspiration, as we saw here. And I can also quote something from a letter about Spillville and Iowa. In this state, Iowa, brewing and selling beer is forbidden, yet the publicans still sell it, but when they are caught, they have to pay a fine. Those Americans are strange people. Sorry. One can hardly believe it, yet they want to drink beer, although they themselves introduced the beer law against themselves. It is better in our country. And of course, you can find some pages, or I think we put the first page of the New World Symphony, so you can see the thing that I've been talking about. So thank you for your attention.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.